Welcome to Post-Soviet Culture and Society. For this week, we will have a brief overview of the Soviet Union before Gorbachev and focus on the relationship between socialism, the state, and society. And these three key things or ideas, socialism, the state, and society, we will be working with throughout the semester. First, we must begin with the revolutions of 1917 and consider the broader context of what becomes the Soviet Union and how this context will shape the post-Soviet period. Historians have argued that the Soviet period was a time of experiment, a time of tragedy, a time of vision unfulfilled. And you will also be considering through your readings and reflection throughout the semester about the context of the post-Soviet culture within this broader context of Soviet history and also the history that was before 1917 of Russia. Russian history is fascinating, and I urge you all to read more fully, take more classes on Russian history. And often, in very broad strokes, historians look at Russia as being guided in many ways by two essential traditions, the tradition of autocracy and of rebellion. Russia had been ruled by the Romanovs since 1613, and as czars of a vast Russian empire, the Russian czars considered themselves to have complete control, political control, and increasingly a vast majority of the czar subjects were tired of this autocratic rule. This is not necessarily a new idea that there is this tradition of rebellion, that throughout the centuries there had been peasant revolts of peasants rising up in anger. But it was particularly in the 19th century that the revolutionary tradition gained momentum, and revolutionary groups and parties began to coalesce and began to really develop revolutionary ideologies. It's argued that the 19th century modernization and industrialization helped to spur on these revolutionary ideas and made the ideas of Marxism attractive and plausible. And we'll be looking at this in more detail also. But Marxism, with its stress on the role of the working class or the proletariat, and the idea that the proletariat would ultimately overthrow the bourgeoisie or middle class, and this class consciousness, class struggle, class war would mark the triumph then of the working class into a fair and equal society, appealed to many workers and peasants and intellectuals. The specific context of the revolutions of 1917 was World War I, 1914 to 1918. World War I was a watershed event that transformed the world and particularly transformed the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. It was the specific context of first the February Revolution of 1917 and then the October Revolution of 1917. Coming out of these two revolutions, first in February, this sort of spontaneous, uncoordinated event, this nationwide protest, led to the overthrow of the Romanovs. And then in October, the Bolsheviks were able to organize the overthrow of the provisional government that had replaced the Romanov rule after the February Revolution. The Bolshevik rule was the outcome, but whether or not it was inevitable remains something to be debated. Even though there's probably no inevitability in history, it did seem highly likely that some sort of authoritarian solution would be what would happen based on this tradition of autocracy or of authoritarian political rule. However, remember this tradition of rebellion, that the vast majority of Russians wanted some kind of variant of socialism, of ownership and operation of means of production and distribution by society or community. So there's this tension inherent in Russian history of autocracy and rebellion, and we'll see this played out perhaps this semester. Well, following the revolution, it became very difficult to realize the promises of revolution and create socialism in a time of war. Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks and the Bolshevik Party, they were Marxists, they had gained power in the October Revolution, and after the October Revolution had overthrown the provisional government and established Bolshevik rule, a civil war followed that was very hard-fought and bloody. And it shaped the Soviet experience. The Bolsheviks won, but at great cost. It's argued that the Civil War helped to perhaps shape Soviet society more than even the revolution itself, based on these years of militarization and regimentation. And it is very difficult to realize the promise of socialism in a time of war and economic collapse. And so these promises were not met. Following Lenin, who died in 1924, Stalin then is able to exert his power and take over until his death in 1953. And Lenin also, his shadow looms large throughout the Soviet period and also in the post-Soviet period. He became sort of a myth and a monument, literally and figuratively, as well as a man, still resting in his mausoleum. Stalin gained control of the party through a series of purges. He was an incredible maneuverist of taking one group of opposition out and then focusing on the next. And he's able to establish his power by 1927 and again remains in essentially total control until 1953. He ended NEP and used the 5-year plans to control society through the use of the command economy. And this command economy will be a central feature of the Soviet Union. The 5-year plans focused on collectivization, industrialization, urbanization, militarization, and the success of these endeavors continues to be debated, and also debated on what cost were some of these successes based on. The Soviet Union, through this period of Stalinism, was a closed, insular society encircled seemingly by capitalist foes. The Great Patriotic War, or what the Americans call World War II, put the Soviet Union to a great test, and particularly Stalinism was put to the test, and was able to beat Nazi Germany. So, according to some, then by beating Nazi Germany, the Stalinist policies, very harsh policies of terror, were vindicated, and Stalin then becomes a great war hero. And again, you'll see this in some of your readings. Following the victory against Nazi Germany, the Cold War quickly ensues, and the Cold War severed any goodwill that had been established between the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II. And then during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States compete for global influence and resources in a divided world. Stalinist Russia was marked by authoritarianism and unquestioning obedience to the authority of a dictator, with one group maintaining complete control. This control was established often by using fear and silencing of civil society or the public. And it has been argued that the Soviet Union did become urbanized, modernized, did emerge as one of the two great world powers after World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, but at what cost? And again, this is a question that is debated, and we'll be looking at this in more detail later on. Stalin died in 1953, and he had established a huge cult of personality. And so Stalinism and its significance will also be important throughout the post-Soviet period into the 21st century. However, I think it's important to remember that there is a distinction between Stalinism and Leninism, and certainly a very marked distinction between Stalinism and socialism, and for that matter, for Marxism. Robert V. Daniels, a conservative historian, I think summed it up very well when he stated, regardless of its labels, the Stalinist regime no longer represented the same movement that took power in 1917. I want to just consider this and think about what this means in terms of socialism and Stalinism. Following the death of Stalin, Khrushchev emerges as the new leader. And one of the crucial acts that he takes at the very short period that he is able to stay in power before he's ousted is that he denounces Stalin. And this is a period of de-Stalinization, or the thaw. And the generation of Gorbachev is deeply affected by the Khrushchev thaw, and also very much deeply affected by the Hungarian revolt in 1956. And the historian Robert Strayer in Why Did the Soviet Union Collapse? Understanding Historical Change, an excellent work if you're interested in reading more, argues that Khrushchev made Gorbachev possible. You might want to consider what that means and the importance of having this initial reform to help this new generation think about alternatives. Khrushchev is ousted, only after 2 years, and the Brezhnev oligarchy is established, and it has a very long period in power, 1964 to 1982. John M. Thompson, I think, sums up the Brezhnev social contract very well in this quote: Brezhnev made an implicit bargain with the Soviet people. He would guarantee them stability, secure and undemanding jobs, and a slowly improved standard of living. In return, they would acquiesce to his authoritarian oligarchic rule. The vast majority of Soviet citizens accepted this arrangement. I think that's a good quote to just kind of ponder a little bit and think about this social contract and how this sort of agreement based on stability and the importance of stability in a society. Although the majority of Soviet citizens maybe acquiesced to this social contract, there was a rising dissident movement. This dissident movement was silenced, but it continued to grow. And there were also cracks in this social contract with the 1968 Czechoslovakian invasion. And the Cold War begins to really heat up with a great deal of Cold War spending. And rock and roll also begins to be, in a part, a opposition movement in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was based on this social contract of status quo and security. And overall, the post-World War II population were satisfied with the system. They did not like the Stalinist terror, and that had been somewhat abated. And they really saw no viable alternative to what their society offered. Overall, the society was confident and optimistic. It was very proud of its accomplishments, particularly in space. There was a perception of overall national achievements, and that they were personally better. At least they were better than they had been before. And this sense of betterment persisted until the early 70s. Overall, there was a belief that the system was okay, but there were cracks in it, and the general population on the whole seems to accept it. We will continue this investigation of the late Soviet period next week.